Smith in the Chicago Alba Solidarity. I was involved in a lot of mostly Cuba, Venezuela solidarity work over the years. But I'm also interested in other issues. I decided to do a workshop here on Iran and in Yemen. And I'll do another one in the other room that I did before on North Korea. Particularly Yemen, after I heard, if you know much about Yemen, I don't think I didn't know until like 2 months ago. When I heard her speak. She's a Yemeni American. She came to Chicago to speak about basically the genocidal war going on there. It's important that U.S. people know what's going on. It's kind of covered up. It's very covered up. She had suggested I have Ben Norton, who also writes a lot and talks a lot about Yemen, speak about Yemen. Ben works, he's a producer and reporter for Real News Network. And he's a contributor to the Fair and Accuracy, Fair, what's it stand for?
Fairness and Accuracy Reporting, a media watch. I mean, we don't need to give a bio.
I don't need a bio? And Intercept, and okay, and this is, you have articles if you want to read more about Yemen. I have a lot of articles here. No Sarah. Okay. And then Kovalik, I've known for a long time. He's he's known people mostly around defending trade unionists in Colombia and exposing the relation of the U.S. government and corporations with death squads in Colombia. But he's also does a lot of work now defending Venezuela, and he's been to all the recent elections to report on it. And he's written a book on the plot to scapegoat Russia, and he has a new book out on the plot to attack Iran, which just come out right now, that I wrote a little review for Counterpunch, if you want a highly condensed version of the book, but it's very easy to read his books, and it's very informative, not just about Iran, but about a lot of U.S. political policy in general. And then Sara Flounders, who's worked with World Party and International Action Center, has written books on U.S. wars on various countries, like Yugoslavia and Iran. And involved in a lot of the anti-war work around these issues, because I don't just want to have a informative session, but people who are involved in fighting against U.S. policy and how you can get involved in opposing U.S. policies on Iran and Yemen and those issues. So I won't talk more. I'll let you have any order. You want to talk first, Dan?
Sure, that's fine.
For maybe 25 minutes each?
Yeah. Okay, great. I'm going to start. I'm going to focus mostly on Iran. Oh yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to focus on Iran itself and just give a little, overview of where we're at with Iran, the nature of Iran now, and how we got to where Iran is today and our relationship with Iran. First of all, so I was in Iran last July. I was invited to speak at the University of Tehran, so I got a chance to go to Tehran and to Isfahan, which is a country in the center of Iran, which if you know about Iran at all, Isfahan is an ancient city, beautiful city. The one thing that struck me, of course, by Iran is just the ancient architecture and ruins there. They have like Zoroastrian buildings that are thousands of years old, and of course, and I mentioned this in the book, as I was going around and seeing these amazing architecture. And by the way, again, not just Islamic architecture, which you have plenty of that, beautiful mosques and mausoleums, but as I said, ancient Zoroastrian architecture, Armenian churches, Christian churches, which are still operational, synagogues, which are still operational. Iran has the second largest Jewish population in the Middle East outside of Israel. This may surprise folks. The Ayatollah Khomeini, who was characterized as, the devil himself, issued a fatwa after the revolution for Jews to be protected in Iran. Iran is a pluralistic society, much more so than many countries in the Middle East, and certainly much more so than our best ally in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia. As Noam Chomsky said recently, for all of Iran's shortcomings, it makes, compared to Saudi Arabia, it looks like a civil rights paradise, right? Which is always important to point out. The other thing, again, I like to point out is that women do fairly well in Iran. They're involved in all walks of life, literature, science, the arts. Tehran even has its own women's firefighting company. Iran has the only state-run condom factory in the Middle East. They make tens of millions of condoms in different flavors and colors. Again, this may be something you don't associate with the Islamic Republic of Iran. But actually, they're big on family planning, and when you get married in Iran, you need to take a family planning course. The point being that it is not the, monolithic society that I think we're taught to believe in this country. With that said, of course, it is an Islamic republic. It has a kind of hybrid government system in which you do have an elected democratic government, and then you have the religious government, and with the supreme ruler, the Ayatollah. And it's an interesting relationship that the secular government has with the Ayatollah. Again, the Ayatollah is the supreme leader, does have the last say on things, though it doesn't mean that sometimes the Ayatollah doesn't defer to the secular government. For example, when President Rouhani wanted to enter into the nuclear discussions with Obama, the supreme leader said, okay, if you want to, go ahead. But he said, I guarantee the U.S. is going to back out on it. They will not keep their part of the deal. But if you want to try it, go ahead. And he did. And the U.S. is backing out on its part of the deal, right? Even though Iran, as everyone agrees, has fulfilled its end of the nuclear deal. It's poured concrete into its nuclear enrichment facilities. And they've gotten almost nothing in return, and now they're certainly going to get nothing. But again, in talking about the nature of the Islamic government in Iran, how did we end up with an Islamic government in Iran? That was not a foregone conclusion. Again, Iran, which used to be called Persia, of course, existed for centuries before Islam was even created. But we got to the point where you have an Islamic Republic. I think we need to trace back to U.S. involvement in that country in the early 1950s. And I think here we see how we ended up where we are today. So, as many of you know, in the early 1950s, the United States and Great Britain, but the U.S. took the lead, overthrew the Democratic Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. I'll just give a little fun fact. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the superintendent of my kids' schools, because my kids went to public schools, was a guy named Mark Roosevelt. His father was Kermit Roosevelt, the CIA bureau chief who overthrew Mossadegh.
You wrote a book about it.
Yeah, right, called Counter Coup, right? Why did we overthrow Mossadegh? For years, Iran had been a vassal of Great Britain, which controlled and profited from Iran's oil industry, which of course is Iran's biggest industry. And in return, the Iranians got very little. You had massive poverty, disease, very little benefit was gotten from the oil industry, while the British were getting tons of benefit. And so ultimately, the parliament there, the Majlis, which still exists to this day, elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh as the prime minister, and he decided, along with the members of the parliament, to nationalize the oil industry of Iran, which, by the way, at this time, Britain, which was led by the Labour Party, was nationalizing its own industries, right? This should not have been a huge shock to the system, but it was to Great Britain, and they were furious, and they decided pretty quickly to get rid of Mossadegh, even though Mossadegh, by the way, was willing to pay for the nationalized industry, though this became a debate, how much he was going to pay and this sort of thing. This is where they got to loggerheads on. Well, when Churchill came back into power in 1951, this is when the Brits really go into fifth gear and overthrowing Mossadegh, but they had a problem. They had been kicked out of Iran, who really hated the British because of how they treated Iran. And so Churchill turned to the United States to do the dirty work, most of the dirty work. The first person approached was President Truman by the Labor government. Truman wasn't interested in the Mossadegh thing. He wasn't interested in defending British Empire in Iran. You know, for all of Truman's faults, that was not one thing he was interested in. When Churchill comes in, he sees a second bite at the apple with President Eisenhower. And he decides, okay, let's soft pedal this oil stuff. Let's sell them on anti-communism. That seems to work every time. And so Eisenhower was convinced that Mossadegh posed a communist threat to the United States. Not that anyone thought Mossadegh was a communist, but they thought he was too close to the Tudeh party in Iran, which was communist, and also that he might be willing to work closely with the Soviet Union. And so this convinced Eisenhower, okay, I guess we'll do it then. So the U.S., through machinations that it used, this is really the first time the CIA does this sort of thing. It supports violence within the country, destabilization. Iran there's a boycott and an embargo against Iran and its oil, which, of course, throws the economy into a tailspin. They cause instability, and we support the rise of the Shah, a king, to come to power. So in supporting democracy in Iran, we put a king in power, and we named a guy named General Zaghetti to be the new prime minister. Zaghetti was famous because during World War II, he collaborated with the Nazis, so that was just fine, of course, with the United States. And the Shah was not very popular, and so the United States, the CIA, and the Mossad of Israel helped create something called the SAVAK, which was a security apparatus which used torture and murder to keep the population at bay. There were thousands of people who were employed by the SAVAK and thousands more who were agents of the SAVAK. It was for lack of a better word, a totalitarian organization that seeped into every part of Iranian life. By the late 70s, Amnesty International concluded that Iran, because of the SAVAK, had the worst human rights in the world. And this was because of not only the overthrow of Mossadegh, but the CIA's support for the SAVAK. And so one might not be too surprised that the Iranians were not crazy about the Shah and the SAVAK. And so in 1979, as I think most of us know, there was a revolution that ousted the Shah. Now, I think it's just important to point out why the revolution was what it was, an Islamic revolution as opposed to, say, a Marxist revolution, because there is a Marxist tradition in Iran that was fairly strong. First of all, during the Shah's reign, the U.S., of course, supported the Shah in rooting out and jailing and killing a lot of leftists. Okay, this is what the U.S. has done throughout the Third World. So the left did not have quite the power it might have had to lead the revolution in 1979. At the same time, the Islamists were able to organize in the mosques. The mosques were the one place in Iranian society that was not penetrated by the SAVAK. And so there was room for organizing in the Islamic communities. And so while the left did participate and had an important role in the revolution, for example, in the oil strikes, which helped bring down the Shah, they weren't in a position to necessarily take the leading role. Moreover, in the 11th hour, when it was clear the Shah was going to go, because one, the people were rebelling, and two, the Shah was diagnosed with cancer, Carter actually worked with the Ayatollah Khomeini to make sure it was he who came to power and not the left, right? Because that would be unacceptable. And so the BBC actually did a story about this 2-week period in which Carter helped maneuver for the Ayatollah to come to power. Okay. 15 minutes left or 15? Okay. And then afterwards, Ronald Reagan worked with Khomeini. The CIA and the MI6 of Britain and the Mossad worked with the Khomeini to kill the rest of the left in Iran. Because the CIA, all these three intelligence groups, had assets in Iran, deep into Iran because of the Shah, they had the names of all these leftist communists throughout Iran, and they gave them to Khomeini. And Khomeini rooted those people out because, one, he saw them as a threat to Islamic rule, and also because there was this MEK terrorist group, which at least called itself Marxist, that he was afraid they would align with. And so he ended up, with U.S. support, rooting out a large part of the left that remained. The other thing that Reagan did, which I think many of you probably heard of or know about. So after the revolution, there was, and after the Shah was admitted to the United States, and this was an important thing, there was a fear in Iran that the U.S. would put the Shah back into power. And so to prevent this, there were some students, radical students, who took members of the embassy, U.S. embassy, hostage. Do people remember this? Some of you are young. If you're old enough, you can't help but remember it. If you're young, maybe at least heard about it. What was interesting about the hostage taking was that we know now that Reagan, who was running for president against Jimmy Carter, actually used a rogue part of the CIA to prevail upon the hostage takers to keep the hostages longer past the election cycle so he could be reelected, because if they were freed under Carter, Carter might have been reelected. So Reagan really became the captor of the hostages for a number of months. This is known as the October Surprise. The late Robert Perry who just died, a great journalist, wrote a book about this October surprise. And there's members of the Mossad, for example, who've signed affidavits about this October surprise. So it's interesting how Reagan, while demonizing Khomeini, he worked with him in these various ways. And again, this is what ultimately where we're at with Iran now and where Iran is as a country. The U.S. is, my point, is largely responsible for. At the same time, the U.S. never forgave Iran for overthrowing the Shah. And so in 1980, the United States backed Saddam Hussein in invading Iran in what became an 8-year brutal war between Iran and Iraq. A war that is not discussed much in the West, but it is not forgotten in Iran. What also is not forgotten is that the Iraqis used chemical weapons that they got from Germany and the United States, killed thousands of Iranians, thousands. You know, it's incredible that, you know, in Syria, you know, every time there's an alleged chemical attack that allegedly kills maybe 40 people, whatever, you know, everyone hits the panic button. Iraq, with our support, was using chemical weapons that killed thousands of Iranians and thousands of Kurds. And, you know, the irony is ultimately when the U.S. overthrows Saddam Hussein and Saddam Hussein is hanged, he is hanged largely because of his gassing of the Kurds, which we helped him do, right? If he was hanged, people like Donald Rumsfeld should have been hanging with him, in all fairness, right?
The U.S. blocked the resolution in the UN to condemn Iraq. The U.S. blocked
At that time, right. And so that is not forgotten by the Iranian people. And again, the sick part of it, too, is that at some point, the U.S. and Israel support both sides of the conflict to keep it going. In part because they wanted to weaken both countries, but also because Reagan, again, acting behind the scenes, wanted to sell weapons to Iran to get money to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, which it had its own revolution in 1979, and we've never forgiven them for overthrowing our dictator Somoza in that country. And so you have this terrible situation in which the West is supporting both sides of this horrible conflict to weaken and ultimately try to destroy them both. Again, this is not forgotten. But notwithstanding all of this, Iran helped the United States after 9/11 in Afghanistan to fight the Taliban. It helped to fight al-Qaeda. And it thought it would get some thanks for this. Instead, very shortly after helping Bush with this war on terror, Bush, you might recall, declared Iran part of the axis of evil with Iraq, its mortal enemy, strangely, and North Korea, a country you probably had very little relations with, and rejected Iran's overtures for a grand bargain in which Iran was willing to put everything on the table to make peace with the United States. And the Iranians have held out the olive branch a number of times, have gotten rid of their nuclear ambitions, although they've always made it clear that the nuclear ambitions were about power, not about weapons. The current Ayatollah has issued a fatwa against the creation and stockpiling and use of nuclear weapons. Just as, by the way, Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa against using chemical weapons. So while the Iraqis were bombarding Iran with chemical weapons, Iran did not retaliate in kind. And again, they don't get much credit for that. Now we are, of course, on the precipice of another conflict potentially with Iran. You know, the talk about a possible invasion of Iran has been on the table for a long time. General Wesley Clark, for example, said that he saw plans for Iran to be the last of the countries in the Middle East to be toppled after Syria. and Iraq and Libya, for example. The war, thankfully, has not come yet, though the U.S. has crippled that country with sanctions, has supported, remember the MEK I mentioned, has continued to support the MEK terrorists who've killed 17,000 people in Iran. John Bolton, our current national security advisor, was a keynote speaker at the MEK conference in Paris last year. But there...
Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, was keynote speaker last month.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. And even Howard Dean has spoken at their conference. They're kind of the darlings of U.S. politicians, it appears. But there hasn't been, a U.S. invasion yet. And this Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson has spoken really well on this, former U.S. Colonel. He said if we went after... He helped actually... As he said, he helped get us into the war in Iraq. He wrote the Yellow Cake speech for Colin Powell, which helped pave the way for the war in Iraq. And he said, I'm not going to do that again. We have to stop this war with Iran. He said, a war with Iran will be 10 to 15 times more costly in terms of lives and treasure than the war in Iraq. If you do the multiplication, you're talking 10 to 15 million dead and many, many trillions spent on such a war. It would be catastrophic. And so I think, we need to do everything we can to prevent this war. And ultimately, if people are not excited about the Islamic Republic, Iran still is a very, very vibrant civil society. They need to be the ones to change their government. If that government's going to be changed, and we need to let them do that. It is not up to the U.S. to engage in some other coup or military intervention in that country. Thank you.
Ben, he's on Real News Network. You just had a good interview with Blumenthal about OAS U.S. intervention in Venezuela. Yeah, very good. Check that out.
That was a great talk. A lot of good information in there. I will say, just to preface really quickly, I'm somewhat sick, so I apologize if I cough and I'm congested during my talk here. And another prefatory note, I think what's interesting is, in some ways it's a good idea that Yemen is on a panel about Iran, because of course they're closely related. But in some ways it's also, I think, somewhat misleading, and I'll be talking today about why trying to lump Iran in with the war in Yemen is a ridiculous talking point used by the US government and its allies to justify continued aggression against the people of Yemen. So first of all, I'll point out that this is the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world, and every time we have this discussion, that needs to be the point we stress from the very beginning. Yemen is suffering from the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. The United Nations has repeated this for years now. So right now, as we speak, 8.4 million Yemenis are on the verge of starvation, according to the United Nations. And just in the past few days, the UN aid chief for Yemen warned that if the US, Saudi, or I'll get to this in a second, explaining the parameters of the war, but the US, UK, Saudi, and Emirati attacks, if they continue on the port of Hodeidah in Yemen, which I'll explain, then another 10 million Yemenis could be on the verge of starvation. So we're talking about 18.4 million, with an M, Yemenis, who are potentially on the verge of starvation. I try not to throw around the word genocidal because it has a very specific meaning, but I think in this context it's actually appropriate. Like, this is actually a genocidal war, and the Saudis, with staunch support from the US and the UK and the Emiratis as well, have made it very clear that they're willing to starve massive numbers of Yemeni civilians to force the country into submission. So I'll explain why the war is happening. I'll explain many of the misleading talking points. But before we have this discussion, we always need to stress this point that as horrific, and it's extremely horrific, as the war in Syria is, as horrific as the situation in Libya is, these countries that have been ravaged by U.S. imperialism, ravaged by war for years, Yemen is still the worst by far on the planet. Again, 18.4 million people potentially on the verge of starvation. By the way, that's 80% of the population. So let's talk about what the war in Yemen is and why this is happening. And first I'll begin by debunking a very common talking point that we hear in corporate media outlets, we hear from the US government, we hear from the Israeli and Saudi governments, and that's that this is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So on March 26, 2015, this is when Saudi Arabia, with the support of the United States and the United Kingdom, launches a bombing campaign in Yemen. The ostensible attempt of Saudi Arabia by launching this bombing campaign is to oust the Houthi movement, I'll explain what they are, from parts of South Yemen and then also from the capital Sana'a. I'll explain, I know there's a lot of names here, I know there's different cities and groups, I'll explain what all these are, but I'm trying to start from the beginning. So from March 2015 until today, Saudi Arabia, with the support of the US and the UK, has relentlessly bombed civilian areas in Yemen, carrying out tens of thousands of air sorties, killing thousands upon thousands of civilians in brutal attacks on hospitals, schools, funerals, wedding parties. A few weeks ago, there was a brutal bombing of a wedding party that killed dozens of people, including the bride, and also wounded the groom. For daily life in Yemen for the past more than 3 years has been hellish. For more than 1,000 days, people have been living under constant bombardment and also a crippling blockade imposed by Saudi Arabia, similar to the blockade of Gaza by Israel. It's not just a naval blockade, it's also an air blockade. They're preventing humanitarian aid from getting in, and around 3/4 of the humanitarian aid comes through what's called the port of Hodeidah. Hodeidah is a major Yemeni port city on the southwest coast. And I'll talk more about that in a bit, because there's recently been an offensive that is being led by the Saudis and the Emiratis with the support of the US and the UK to try to take Hodeidah from the Yemeni rebel group, the Houthis, which could lead to massive civilian casualties, as I mentioned, millions of people starving. But I know it's hard to, Yemen is one of these issues where there's not that much information, so there are a lot of names and things to learn, and I'm trying to go in a logical order, and I understand that you might be confused about some things. Hopefully I can clarify those in a bit. But I just want to stress that from the beginning, from March and April 2015, when Saudi Arabia began bombing Yemen, again, we must stress, with weapons, military intelligence, and fuel from the US, since that point, for more than 1,000 days, the narrative we've heard is that Saudi Arabia is waging this war to stop a supposed Iranian proxy group from waging a campaign of terror in Yemen. This is absolutely preposterous. The Houthi movement, which in late 2014 moved south from the north of Yemen, this is a somewhat tribal group in the north of Yemen. Some people have compared it to Hezbollah. That if you had to make a comparison, maybe that's Lebanese Hezbollah is maybe a somewhat similar group, although they have very different histories. The Houthis were formed, their official name is Ansar Allah, and technically that's what we should call them, but people don't really know what that is, so I'll call them the Houthis. They're named after a family, the Houthis, who created the group in the 1990s. So in 1990, South and North Yemen unified. During the Cold War, the south of Yemen, in fact, was the only Marxist government in the Middle East. There were some other socialist governments, but it was the only Marxist-oriented government in the Middle East. It was allied with the Soviet Union. In 1990, with the counter-revolution in the Eastern Bloc and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the North wages a war. The North, which was formerly colonized by the British, and the North, which has the South was colonized. The North has a kind of nationalist-oriented government. It's certainly not Marxist, yet alone socialist, but it kind of tries to forge a somewhat independent path. The North in 1990 wages a war of reunification on the South, and Yemen is unified as we know it today. Although I'll talk about how the war has actually in some ways broken it apart again. So in 1990, Yemen is reunified under the leadership of a man named Ali Abdullah Saleh. just Salah, as he's known. He was just killed last year by the Houthis. I know this is complicated, but I'll try to explain this in a bit. So Salah is, again, a kind of nationalist. He's from the north. So for some people in the south, this is seen as a kind of act of aggression. And that still explains some of the sectarian tension in Yemen today. Also, when we talk about these misleading narratives on Yemen, to understand that this is certainly not, by any stretch of the imagination, a sectarian religious conflict. If anything, there are elements of sectarian geography in politics. Because Yemen was, from the 1960s until 1990, divided, there still are these echoes of northern and southern, different cultural, political, religious identities. So religion is one element of that, but it's not so much a Sunni-Shia conflict as it is a north-south conflict. And then, of course, an international conflict a war being waged on Yemen. So South Yemen, the capital of which was Aden, which is one of the major cities, comes under the control of the north and is unified. And what happens is, in the southern parts of the country, with the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, you have an influx of Saudi investment, Emirati investment, from some of the US-backed Gulf regimes in the region, which have been cultivated for decades under the tutelage of the American and British empires, and are theocratic absolute monarchies, especially in the case of Saudi Arabia, which is known for exporting an extremist distorted form of Sunni Islam known as Wahhabism. And what happens is, in the south of Yemen, which is Sunni majority, there is the rising influence of Wahhabism as Saudi investment comes in. So frequently the deal with the devil that's been made throughout the Cold War, and then especially since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, is this kind of procedure that is always backed, again, by the US. And that's that Saudi Arabia will provide support financially and politically for charities, schools, madrasas, and other institutions in somewhat poor, underdeveloped, formerly colonized Muslim-majority countries. And in return for that, Saudi Arabia will send its own clerics, will spread its own TV shows and Wahhabi propaganda. And what happens is the population is, largely becomes much more conservative as people go to madrasas. This is the case study of this is in Indonesia. You don't have time to get into Indonesia, like the brutal US-backed genocide in 1966-67 against the communists. But after then, there was a somewhat more secular government, which has become more and more Islamist in orientation. And as Saudi Arabia, especially after a recent flood, or a recent horrific hurricane that killed thousands of people, there's been a lot of Saudi investment, and there's been a major rise in Wahhabi influence, a lot of Indonesians joining ISIS. Saudi Arabia funds a school for free in Indonesia for anyone to attend, and it has mandatory Islamic studies, mandatory Fusha Arabic classes. So this is part of, it has its origins in the Cold War. It was a strategy adopted by the US and the UK to prevent Arab nationalism and communism from spreading in the Middle East, and that was using right-wing Islamism. I'm not saying Islamism is inherently reactionary, it's not, but in the case of Saudi Arabia, this is a right-wing, extremely reactionary Islamism that has been spread. And after reunification in Yemen, in the south, Saudi Arabia also supported what's called Islah, which is the Muslim Brotherhood Party. In Yemen, it's extremely right-wing. This is also complicated history because today, Saudi Arabia actually considers the Muslim Brotherhood to be a terrorist organization only because the Muslim Brotherhood poses the biggest threat to the rule of the Saudi royal family in terms of groups that could actually likely overthrow the Saudi royal family. But Saudi Arabia cultivated Islah and right-wing Islamist groups, primarily in the south of Yemen, but also to an extent in the north. The north of Yemen is majority Zaidi, which today is considered Shia, although I know a lot of Zaidi Yemenis, and what they often jokingly say, which it's just true, is that they didn't consider themselves Shia really until 2011, until the so-called Arab Spring. And that's a misleading term phrase for a lot of reasons. But in 2011, there was a protest movement that ousts Ali Abdullah Saleh and brings in ostensibly an election in 2012, but there's no other candidate, and the person who is put into power by the US and the Gulf regimes around Yemen is Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi. And Hadi is a pretty loyal puppet in the south of Yemen. And I'll get to that in a second. But the point is that in 2011, there are these protests, and there's a rise of sectarian tension. So in the south, you have a Sunni majority population. In the north, you have a Zaidi. Again, this is not a religious conflict, but in terms of understanding how these political conflicts map themselves out. Just as the conflict in Ireland is not a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics, but because of people's cultural and political identities, they kind of map themselves out in some ways on religious lines. So in the north, you have Zaidis. About 40% of the Yemeni population is Zaidi. This is an unorthodox, kind of loosely Shia sect of Islam, although in practice it's actually pretty similar to what's known as Hanafi Islam, which is the main madhab, it's the mainstream Sunni Islam practiced by the former parts that were ruled by the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire. The majority of Sunnis in the world, the majority of Muslims in the world follow the Hanafi school of Islamic jurisprudence, known as the madhab. So the Zaidis in the north of Yemen, the Shia, are actually closer to Sunni than they are to Iranian Shiaism, which is Twelver Shiaism. However, there's been a concerted attempt in the post-2011 years, after the ouster of Salah and the expansion of Saudi influence in Yemen, there's been a concerted attempt to portray the Houthis as Shia who are somehow similar to Iranian Shia and Iraqi Shia. And this is part of this anti-Shia myth of the Shia crescent, the Shiite crescent you've probably heard. It's spread by a lot of these more right-wing anti-Shia, Salafi, Wahhabi groups. And so what happens is, in this period, with the reunification of Yemen in 1990, I mentioned you have the rise of Wahhabi influence that comes from Saudi investment in the south. In response to that in the north, you have the rise of a kind of Zaidi nationalism, if you will, somewhat Shia-oriented, similar in some ways to Hezbollah, in the way that Hezbollah was a kind of Shia nationalist group in Lebanon that pushed out the Israeli military occupation of South Lebanon, and then fought a war and pushed out Israel again in Lebanon in 2006. Again, they're not exactly the same, and actually it's kind of propaganda by Saudi Arabia and Israel to portray the Houthis as the Yemeni Hezbollah to justify the continued war. But it's not a totally ridiculous comparison. And the Houthis began organizing in the 1990s, and they're based in Sada in the north of Yemen. And in fact, there's a low-intensity war waged between the central government of Yemen, led by Salah, and the Houthis from 1994 until 2000, a 6-year on-and-off low-intensity war. So ironically, I said 1994, from 2004 until 2010. So just before Salah is ousted in 2011, there was a 6-year war from 2004 to 2010 between the Houthis and the central government. This is when they get a lot of training. This is when they actually capture a lot of weapons from the Yemeni military. And this is important because this gets us, I will fast forward in a minute to the war today, because the narrative is that the Houthis are an Iranian proxy who were backed militarily by Iran to overtake the so-called legitimate government of Yemen and impose an Iranian-style government that is going to fight Saudi Arabia and Israel. That's ridiculous. As I mentioned, the Houthis have their origins in the 1990s as a grassroots organization that emerged, and then they waged a war against the central government from 2004 to 2010, and that's when they got a lot of their weapons and began training. And it's also important to understand that Yemen, in some ways, the U.S. is totally on planet Mars when it comes to the militarization of our society. We have by far the largest number of weapons per capita, of firearms per capita. Yemen, however, does come in a somewhat close second. The U.S. and Yemen are unique in that there are so many weapons flooded in both of these countries that there are few parallels in the rest of the world. So the idea that the Houthis wouldn't even need weapons from Iran is pretty outrageous in the first place, and it demonstrates how little a lot of these propagandists know about Yemen. I mean, I have friends from North and South Yemen who would joke that you'll walk down the street and see people with like assault rifles just hanging out, just like they're in their trucks and they have just heavy weaponry. Part of this is also because of the so-called war on terror. In post-2001, post-9/11, the U.S. Allies with Salah as a way to counter the growing influence of al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula. That's AQAP, which is one of the most extreme forms of al-Qaeda in the Middle East. So the U.S. ironically allies with Saleh and gives the Yemeni army huge weapons shipments to help fight al-Qaeda. Of course, the U.S. wages a drone war as well, which is ongoing. So what happens is, fast forwarding, Saleh is ousted. Hadi, who is now seen as the so-called elected representative who's supposedly the legitimate government of Iran. Hadi is the president recognized by the United Nations, but as I mentioned, he ran in an election where there were no other candidates, and then he overstayed his term in office, and then he fled the country when the Houthis took over the capital Sana'a in late 2014, and then he fled to Saudi Arabia, where he has stayed for the majority of this conflict. So this is a Saudi puppet backed by the U.S. Who is seen as the internationally recognized president. He's the internationally recognized dictator. So in late 2014, fast forwarding to the war, I know that's a lot of information. I know it might seem not entirely relevant, but we have to understand the origins of the war. We'll get to, and then I'll spend 5 minutes here talking about the war itself. So in late 2014, the Houthis, which I mentioned had been growing, formed in the 1990s, expanding in the 2000s. They moved southward, and they have support. I mean, the Houthis certainly are not, some progressive revolutionary socialist group. No one's going to pretend that. But they're a kind of nationalist-oriented group that is dedicated specifically to violently countering al-Qaeda and ISIS. And you have the rise of these Wahhabi-influenced extremist groups that are bombing Zaidi mosques. There are actually horrific suicide bomb attacks on Zaidi. These are the unorthodox Shia mosques in 2014, before the war even begins, in which hundreds of Zaidi civilians are killed in attacks that were claimed by AQAP or ISIS. There's also growing ISIS influence in Yemen. So because the Houthis are countering these extremist groups, and because they have this kind of nationalist-oriented anti-corruption campaign, they talk a lot about corruption and about supporting the people and creating social programs. They're somewhat populist in orientation. They have some support in the north, and they continue moving southward, and then they capture the capital, Sana'a. And as I mentioned, Hadi flees the country, the internationally recognized president, who kind of was not really elected, flees to Saudi Arabia. And then in March 2015, in an attempt to oust the Houthi movement, the Ansar Allah, from Sana'a and from southern parts of the country, Saudi Arabia wages a brutal bombing campaign and just begins relentlessly targeting civilian areas in an attempt to force the population into submission. With the help of the U.S., they impose a crippling naval and air blockade, again using starvation as an intentional tactic to force Yemenis into submission. And we must always stress, media outlets tend to forget this. They'll mention Saudi-led coalition. They'll use the term Saudi-led coalition. But while it is technically the Saudi Air Force that is doing the bombing, while there are technically Saudi troops involved as well as Emirati troops, this is all done with the protection under the aegis of the U.S. and the U.K. governments, with billions of dollars in weapon sales from the U.S. and the U.K., military intelligence and assistance, in-air refueling, with millions of barrels of oil, of gallons of fuel being put into Saudi warplanes, literally in the air while they're waging these bombing campaigns by the U.S. military. The U.S. Navy is helping to enforce the naval blockade on Yemen. So this is, I use the term U.S.-Saudi, or if you want to be really long and be more specific, U.S., U.K., Saudi, UAE war. These are the main actors. Technically, there's what's called an Arab coalition backed by the U.S. of Sudan, technically Bahrain. I mean, there's Egypt, but these countries aren't really playing the main role. I mean, Sudan did have some mercenaries who were being paid by the Emiratis to fight in Yemen. Also, interestingly, the Emiratis hired Colombian mercenaries who were notorious for, being extremely right-wing, egregious human rights abuses and torture. So there are many mercenaries hired by the Emiratis. And the Emiratis have in fact started to colonize South Yemen as this conflict is going on. All, again, under the protection of the US and the UK. They know what's happening. The Emiratis couldn't do this without US and UK support. There's an island called Socotra, which is off the south of Yemen. It's an extremely unique island. It's recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It has extremely unique, kind of almost sci-fi looking fauna, like these interesting trees, it's amazing. It's a very beautiful, this tropical island. It's been taken over militarily. I mean, it was already taken over economically by the Emiratis, but the UAE literally sent tanks in, and they have colonized and taken over this island. Again, totally with the support, rubber stamped by the US and the UK. in the south of Yemen, there's a massive influx of Emirati capital. They're essentially colonizing the south as well. And what's happened is there's been essentially a kind of breakup, unofficially returning to pre-1990 Yemen, where the south and north are not united. And I'll talk a bit more here. I only have a few more minutes. So what has happened is that the Houthis, they went south, and it's true that they did capture some cities because the government was weak and they were addressing legitimate grievances. The Houthis did capture some cities that were beyond the kind of traditional, like Zaidi North Yemeni influence, including Aden, and they were pushed out early in the war. So the Houthis did overextend themselves and go into area in which they were not really that popular. However, there's been largely a stalemate from the beginning of the conflict. Really, since 2015, there has not been significant change. There haven't been significant shifts. Unlike, say, the war in Syria, where there have been significant gains by the Syrian government, it retook Aleppo, Homs. It's largely been a stalemate in Yemen, and that's because the parts that the Houthis control, which represent about 80% of the populated areas of Yemen, Saudi Arabia is not popular in these parts of the country. And if you look at how the Saudi and Emirati-backed government in the south has governed, it's not an ideal alternative by any stretch of the imagination. There's this thing that's been organized called the security belt, which is essentially this privatized police that is paid by the Emiratis. They basically control South Yemen. I mean, there's technically a legitimate government, but what's interesting is there are now even contradictions within that US-backed government against the Emiratis. So the Saudis back Hadi, I know this is complicated, but the Saudis back Hadi, who's the internationally recognized dictator, against the Emiratis, and there's this kind of inter-capitalist rivalry between the Saudis and the Emiratis over influence inside South Yemen. So that brings us to the humanitarian situation I began with. There's a stalemate. The Houthis are not going anywhere. And in fact, the Houthis never wanted to control the entire government. They formed an alliance with Saleh, the former president, and Saleh stabbed them in the back and turned on them and was willing to ally with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the US and the UK in a secret operation, this was last year, to try to oust the Houthis. And they killed him. And now the Houthis are entirely in control. That was never their plan. If you listen to their rhetoric, that was never their intention. They said, we wanted a legitimate representation in this government. We wanted people to recognize, the plight of people in Sada, the plight of, this rural area. And we wanted people to address corruption. But they are now governing the country. And there are talks of a potential new government formed with Saleh's old party, the GNC, General National Congress. But it's really a political stalemate. And while we're in this political stalemate, where there have been few political gains, the Saudis and Emiratis, with support from the US and the UK, have decided that they're going to do anything they can to retake the country and force out the Houthis. And if they have to starve millions of Yemenis, so be it. That is their strategy. They can't really retake significant areas from the Houthis, especially the capital. It's not going to happen. They've brutally bombed Sana'a, the capital, for 3 years now, killing thousands of people, and have barely budged an inch. All they've done is just killed large numbers of Yemenis. And it's important to understand that we read these media reports talking about at least 10,000 Yemenis have died. The AP has ironically reported this for 2 years, and the death toll hasn't changed. The reporting on this is so bad. And the 10,000 figure, which was true 2 years ago, that was only violent deaths. That grossly underestimates the severity of this conflict. The vast majority of Yemenis who have died from preventable humanitarian causes, primarily malnutrition and starvation and disease. The war has unleashed the largest cholera epidemic in recorded history. This is a cholera epidemic that's even significantly worse than the cholera epidemic in Haiti after the earthquake. The worst in recorded history. Records for cholera began in 1949. Really, the Saudis and Emiratis, with US and UK support, have bombed Yemen back into the medieval age on purpose, trying to starve and kill Yemenis, really, until they submit, until they just totally submit to Saudi and Emirati domination of their country. Why are they doing this? There are a few different reasons. One, it's ridiculous to say that the Houthis are an Iranian proxy. In fact, ironically, when Saleh was an ally of the US in the war on terror, Saleh exaggerated the Houthis' influence by Iran, or Iran's influence with the Houthis, and intentionally tried to portray them as an Iranian proxy to get, while he was waging war against them between 2004 and 2010, to get more weapons from the Americans. So what's funny is the Americans drank their own Kool-Aid on this intelligence. Obviously, they don't even need real intelligence. They'll just make things up to justify the military conquest. But this idea that the Houthis are an Iranian proxy is ridiculous. Even the UN panel of experts, or the UN convened a panel of experts, and they wrote a report that tried to look at supposed Iranian arms shipments into Yemen. And they documented 6 intercepted arms shipments that maybe came from Iran, but they couldn't even prove they were destined for Yemen in the first place. They went to Somalia, and it's not entirely clear. And even if, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that the Iranians did send these arms shipments to Yemen, it's not heavy weaponry. These are, hundreds or maybe a few thousand assault rifles, a few rocket launchers, but this is not the kind of significant weaponry we saw, for instance, the CIA send into Syria. It pales in comparison. We need to understand that the Houthis raided the Yemeni army's arms reserves, and also elements of the Yemeni army defected to the Houthi movement when they took over. So this attempt to portray this as an Iran-Saudi proxy war is outrageous. It's not an Iran-Saudi proxy war. I mean, if anything, Iran's influence has been political, and that is significant. I mean, Iran does politically support the Houthis at the United Nations, through media reports, but this is a war being waged on Yemen by Saudi Arabia and the UAE with the support of the traditional imperialist powers, the US and the UK, and it has resulted in the largest humanitarian catastrophe in the world and very little political gains. And the only way that the Saudis and Emiratis could win is by starving millions of Yemenis to death, and they may very well do that with US support if anti-war activists don't organize to stop it.
I knew very little about Yemen until I heard Shireen Al-Demi speak. Al-Demi? One thing we need to, when you're starting to learn about a country and what's really going on there, and you don't know anything, it's maybe the most difficult part is finding the people to read, to actually learn about it, because there's so much people who are deliberately misinforming you and people who are just misinforming you because they're misinformed. But these 2 people are very well informed on what's going on in Yemen, and they do a lot. You can go to their, I don't know if she has a website or not, but I mean, she's on YouTube. She speaks a lot. She was on Democracy Now! A little while ago talking about Yemen, and you might be not any solidarity group or anything in your area about Yemen, but you can always go to their websites or YouTube and post their articles on different lists to inform people about what's going on in Yemen. So thank you for the work that you do, because there's not many people who are really doing much work about Yemen that I'm aware of. Now I have Sarah speak, and I have some copies of their paper, the World Party paper.
Can I speak standing up? I'm just more comfortable.
Sure, you can speak.
He said he needs audio.
They have very good anti-imperialist positions in their paper, and I have some extra copies here from the last meeting I was at. And Dan has your book.
Yep.
Did you say how much it was?
Well, its list price is
It's okay
20, so
here?
for 10, it has a chapter on Yemen, as a nice refresher for what Ben said. As well as one on Nicaragua, which also had a revolution in 1979.
1/3?
Became very interlinked because of
Okay.
Reagan's response.
He spoke, 35, 40 minutes? I don't know, because I don't have time for Q&A, so let me know at 25.
Okay.
Well, is this mic on? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me start by thanking Stan and Ben and Dan. I want to address Iran. It seems the more things change, the more they remain the same. And U.S. complete hostility to Iran is a major imperialist frustration ever since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Just swept the corrupt, compliant monarchy into the dustbin. And it pushed aside U.S. British domination of the oil and gas resources, and this revolutionary upsurge overwhelmed the brutal repressive apparatus, the notorious and seemingly all-powerful Savak. It just went down in this huge upsurge. It was unstoppable. For 25 years, the Shah was the staunchest U.S. ally ever since the CIA planned coup put him on the throne, back on the throne in 1953, and overthrew the democratically elected Mossadegh government. I realize that Dan touched on this, but just to kind of fast forward in terms of where we are today, the Iranian Revolution, tens of millions strong, was an enormous setback for the U.S. in the most strategic region. And it changed the entire political terrain in the region that has 2/3 of the oil resources. Old Iran was a U.S. corporate pillar, and its role was to guard U.S. interests in the region and to pay billions of dollars for U.S. weapons systems, and to stash all the money in U.S. banks. So this staggering defeat in West Asia came just 4 years after the U.S. defeat in Vietnam and the loss of Southeast Asia. So just to have these two huge developments in mind, the military defeat in Vietnam, this huge revolutionary overturn in Iran. And Iran has been on the hit list ever since. Republican or Democratic administration, whether it's Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, and now Trump, one after the other. The U.S. sanctions on Iran, they predate the limited Iranian program for nuclear energy. The sanctions, and there's been lots of other forms of economic destabilizations, artificial shortages, a freeze on billions of Iranian assets that were in U.S. banks, millions of spare parts of U.S. equipment that could no longer be fulfilled, everything from refrigeration to escalators to jet aircraft to the parts in the refineries. In the pumping stations. It was a big deal when Iran first was finally able to develop its own refinery and refine its own oil. There was industrial and economic sabotage and internal subversion and attempted coups. There's been assassinations of political leaders to scientists, of course drone attacks, and U.S. nuclear encirclement, aircraft carriers and bases. And this ring of U.S. bases are in all the feudal monarchies of the Persian Gulf. And yet all these efforts have failed. And that's significant. That's significant, and when I say U.S. from every direction is frustrated by this. And through decades, 39 years, there's been nonstop demonization by the corporate media. Iran is always charged with support of terrorism, with building weapons of mass destruction, with building a nuclear weapon. And that constant demonization provides a completely distorted lens, and it's always used to justify war. Now, I traveled to Iran only once, but I was deeply impressed, and I've visited most countries of the region, but I was deeply impressed by the modern society, the highly educated population, and the fierce determination to hold on to sovereignty, the pride in Persian culture, ancient and modern, and the identification with other oppressed and developing countries. In 39 years, this attitude has really become part of the culture. I'm very glad that Dan took up many of the accomplishments of Iran since the revolution. I want to deal much more with this U.S. hostility and frustration. And it's the same hostility that we see to Venezuela, to People's Korea, to Yemen, to Cuba, to China, to Russia. It's that no developing country can seek to maintain its sovereignty. No country should be allowed to challenge the domination of U.S. control, the control of Wall Street, without facing an overwhelming and immediate threat and an aggressive destabilization effort. But just to say something on Iranian culture that really struck me, and it's just never represented here, even in the political movement here. Now, when I was in Iran, I had an opportunity to meet a few times, with a wonderful activist group called OLA, House of Latin America, in Tehran. And this group hosted a visiting delegation from the Cuban Young Communist League that traveled throughout Iran to every college, having meetings with students, talking about Cuba and how Cuba was developing and exchanging with Iranian students. Surprised me. They had a big art exhibit of students' paintings of Chavez and solidarity with Venezuela. They had delegations from Bolivia, from Ecuador. So this kind of exchange you don't really even think of happening. And I also had an opportunity to visit a kind of a computer and high-tech big exhibition, and you could see the enormous involvement of young people, and especially young women, very much leading the way on a lot of this. Now, Iran's not a small country, 80 million people, as I say, educated, technically advanced, proud, and determined, and has provided real solidarity, at least political solidarity. The Palestinian struggle, the struggle in Lebanon, in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And it's that crime, that's a crime that the U.S. is demanding that they pull back on. That and the crime of their nationalized oil and refusing to completely open their economy, that's Iran's crimes. Not this myth of nuclear weapons. But what was surprising was that Trump's latest provocation of canceling the internationally signed nuclear agreement ran into a stunning rebuke internationally from every other signer. There's been not a shred of support for the U.S. position. That's important. And it was followed domestically by a unanimous congressional resolution that was stuck on the annual military appropriations bill just last week. This unanimous resolution, bipartisan resolution, said that unauthorized war with Iran was not an option. Congress must be consulted. Now, we should always keep in the back of our mind that U.S. wars always start by staged provocations. It doesn't mean if they're determined to go to war, they won't go to war, and congressional resolutions, international law be damned. But both represent a big setback because it shows that today it's U.S. imperialism that is more isolated than Iran on a global scale, and even here at home. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, the whole U.S. strategy, Washington's strategy, has been to isolate and encircle Iran. So this is a pretty big crisis for the U.S. global empire. And their frustration is dangerous. So we always have to be prepared for more extreme measures because Washington has had so many setbacks in the last few years. And just to describe some of that history, the U.S. failed in Iraq to secure any of the goals that they had for Iraq except the complete destruction of Iraq. But corporate power, U.S. corporate power, couldn't consolidate itself after this massive invasion and decade-long occupation. They couldn't gain economic and political control. They couldn't even maintain their bases in Iraq. The U.S. has failed in Afghanistan, about the poorest country in the world, 17 years of war. Afghanistan has no defense system whatsoever. And yet there's not one province that's secure, not one military post. The U.S. has failed in Syria, 7 years of war. They armed over 100,000 mercenaries and extremist forces, and yet they have failed to overturn the Syrian government. They have inflamed in both Iraq and in Syria, sectarian war of the most vicious nature, Sunni against Shia, and yet it has failed in terms of consolidating a U.S. position and is now being pretty decisively pushed back. It's not only ISIS that's being pushed back, it's this use of sectarian war that is really facing a real defeat in the whole region. And the only two U.S. proxy forces in the region, Israel and Saudi Arabia, have all failed in their efforts to destroy people's movements. I mean, Israel was literally chased out of Lebanon in total disarray in 2000, and then in 2006, their invasion was a complete fiasco. Israel has utterly failed to subdue the Palestinian people, and I think we can't speak anywhere without saluting the heroic level of resistance in Gaza today. It shows even with nothing but stones, the determination to resist is a political and material force in history. So it shows how once it's in the very fabric of the society, there's no power that can defeat people who are determined to resist. And that image of Gaza is strong in the whole region. The U.S. left a smoking ruin in Libya, but they still have no leverage there. So now, just on to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia originally announced that they were going to have a cleanup operation in Yemen that would last a few weeks. They're 3 years into this war, and as Ben described, it is so totally bogged down. Even though it's the U.S. Navy that maintains the blockade and the U.S. Air Force that fuels the jets in midair and provides the satellite reconnaissance and the technical backup so the Saudis can use this expensive hardware. And it has created the world's worst, I so agree with that, humanitarian disaster. And I'm glad it's labeled a genocide. It really is a threat to the entire people. More than 8 million really on the verge of absolute starvation, a cholera epidemic like the world has never seen. And the response is that the Pentagon is speeding up its arms exports to both Saudi Arabia and to Israel and South Korea. So this is the response from the U.S. It's always only weapons. Today, the U.S. empire no longer has the economic leverage that it had a generation ago. And that has to be a factor when you're looking at anything going on in the world today. It's an empire in serious decline and decay, and it's lost the overwhelming advantage that it had a generation ago in industry and technology and banking and communications. Think about it. Besides weapons sales and massive unpayable debt and U.S. bases, is there anything that the U.S. empire can offer any developing country? It has nothing really to offer. So these problems, they can't drag the world back. They really can't succeed in recolonizing the world, which is what they hoped and expected to do with the collapse in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, that this would be a new day, the American century. Think of all that 20 years ago, what we were hearing, that there was nothing to stop this roll, this reconquest, this recolonization. And it has not worked out that way because the people of the world are refusing recolonization and subjugation. Now, we don't want to be lulled by the failures of the U.S. military and economic power. But it's also true that today U.S. war with Iran faces big problems at home. And that's been true for years. You know, they do these polls all the time. They release the results all the time. There was a poll in 2010, CBS, that said only 2 in 10, 20%, of people in the U.S. would go to war with Iran if they tested a bomb or if they attacked Israel. Only 25% would go to war if Iran attacked the U.S. on its own soil. I looked at that, I got a problem.
We just surrender.
And 25% of the population would not support a war with Iran under any circumstances. Now, what's the purpose of these polls? It shows them how much work they got to do with their media, right? It's nonstop demonization, 24/7. They got to pump it up again. 2012, 70% of people in the U.S. would oppose any strike on Iran. Now, 2018, they posed a question all kinds of new ways, but the majority of the population, 56%, were against Trump canceling out of this nuclear agreement that was signed. And only 26% were opposed to the agreement or supported Trump. So this is really, and yet that figure, which when I looked at the past figures, I wondered why the pollsters said that the numbers are actually running at an all-time high. Maybe it's because the other questions that weren't asked. But all of this was the basis of the congressional resolution, that there's a recognition in Congress, whether Democrat or Republican, whatever these politicians are, that's the basis behind their unanimous resolution against going to unauthorized war with Iran. At the same time, they overwhelmingly did vote for the National Defense Authorization Act, the largest all-time military budget in history that authorized the development of a whole new low-yield submarine-launched nuclear warheads and a lot of other really scary weapons that are called even more radical and extreme. So we shouldn't place too much confidence in congressional resolutions. Sometimes it's cover for the war resolution that they're really passing, and at the same time a way of saying, no, see, we're really not for war. U.S., of course, spends more on war and military than the rest of the world put together, and it's the largest arms seller. They'll sometimes say that it's the largest, it's ahead of 8 or 10 other countries combined. But that's really, that's the entire world when you're talking about nuclear and military weapons.
Well, of those 8, many are U.S. allies anyway.
Right, that's so true. And those 8 are U.S. allies.
Includes Saudi Arabia.
Many. So let me switch to another response on the international situation to Trump canceling this internationally signed nuclear deal with Iran to stop development simply of nuclear energy, not a nuclear weapons program. That gets forgotten and lost and set aside in the U.S. media. But it had no support in Europe, or in Japan. Now these are the U.S., kind of co-predators of the globe. So it's important that they backed off too. The European Union, even Britain, they rejected this policy, Washington's policy on the nuclear deal. So this shows that Trump is truly isolated, and U.S. is isolated in many parts of the world. But it may lead them to calculate that the only way to revive U.S. authority is war with Iran or with North Korea. Sometimes the only way to reassert themselves is to start a war. And this is why it's a dangerous time, why we can't assume that things are going so bad it'll just continue to wind down like this. They only have weapons to offer. They don't have economic progress, they don't have industrial or technological development or cultural development to offer. They have bases and militarism to offer. It's their only tool, and it's a very dangerous moment. Now, they are facing another impediment. I think we all know, oh good, I got 5 minutes, I can wrap this up. We all know a lot of publicity, a lot of attention on Trump's visit with Kim Jong-un in terms of maybe some sort of, quote, nuclear agreement with the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, DPRK. That's June 10th. There's a very important meeting that Chinese President Xi Jinping just invited the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani to on June 9th and 10th. A regional summit meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's going to be in the Chinese coastal city of Qingdao. Who else is coming to this meeting besides the Iranian president, of course, hosted by the Chinese president? Also in attendance will be Russia's President Putin, India's Prime Minister Modi, Pakistan's President Hussein, the other Shanghai Cooperation Organization top representatives from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. So this is a very important meeting that's happening, and a lot of it will deal with how to give economic support to Iran in the face of new round of U.S. sanctions, and how to have more economic cooperation in the entire region. And there's been a lot of publicity in the Chinese media, not much here at all, not much. But of course, we never really hear about what's happening in the rest of the world at all here. We hear about the rising trade and tariff tensions, and no country knows they're coming next, including Canada or Mexico or Britain. Countries just think they're, with the US on this, and they suddenly are facing economic dislocation. But the idea of China and Russia and India and Pakistan, meeting with Iran and also discussing fields of nuclear power and energy and finance and trade and oil. This is very important, very important. And it's a proper setting, a proper meeting just before Trump's meeting with Korea. It's maybe the best protection and defense also of People's Korea. We should think about it that way. And I'll bet it gets almost no publicity here. But do you think US planners aren't very aware of it? Or of China's plan to pour billions of dollars into infrastructure and energy projects throughout the region? Kazakhstan, major gas pipeline in Tajikistan, and so on. So let me wind up this on saying our role. Our role, I really think, is talking about how to keep Korea and Iran and Venezuela and Yemen and Palestine on the front burner of the US movement, and to be much more confident that we have been in the power of people's movements of all different forms of resistance to understand what's in their own interests of sovereignty, of self-determination, of control of their own resources. The more we reject all the mechanizations and demonizations for war, and the more we link it to the absolute destruction of life here in the US, the enormous cost of these 1,000 bases around the world, the enormous cost just of the newest military budget means every single city in the US faces new level of cutbacks. Every teacher strike is up against the military budget. Every single possible social gain that we have had in decades of struggle is now on the chopping block. So linking these issues is a time when it draws the strongest possible response. And I think this is, we got to both look at history, look at the past, look at the situation of this decaying empire, look at the level of increased repression, and stand with people of the whole world.
Okay, thank you. Before we open it up for questions, let me say you could also invite them or Dan to speak on public radio stations. I mean, some of them are pretty corporate, but some of them are progressive enough. There's some around Chicago and the Midwest area. I could get some of them on. And you'll be doing a speaking tour on your book in some time?
Yes,
If you're
yeah, I'm always available to speak, starting now, so. Happy to do it. I wanted to just add one thing, just, kind of linking all these things.
You're mentioning the effect, of course, on our incredible military spending on our society. There was just an MIT economist who concluded what most of us have been saying and seeing for years, and that is that the United States is now a developing country. That it went from being a developed country to now being a third world country.
Right, that's true on every level. Infant mortality, women in childbirth, healthcare, senior care.
Homelessness, yeah.
Homelessness, right. Educational levels, it really is pretty shocking.
The military has destroyed this society. And as you say, I worry that because the U.S. has, as you say correctly, nothing else to offer the world, no more moral legitimacy or political legitimacy, that all we are is a military power. And so every problem looks like a nail. And that's pretty scary.
Let's hear from the audience.
Yep.
Okay, before I take questions, I first started reading about Iran when the book came out by Phil Wilato called In Defense of Iran, and I wrote down some of the information he had in it that if it wasn't mentioned here, I wanted to mention it. He said it was written in 2009. He said the number of poor in Iran is 1/8 of it was what it was under the Shah, so 7/8 of the poverty they had gotten rid of by 2009. So workers get 4 weeks vacation a year. 1970, only 25% of Iranian women could read and write. By 2007, it was 80%. The women now make up 60 to 70% of college students, and the universities are free. Women get 90 days of maternity leave at 2/3 pay. And they have equal pay for equal work. Like they have an ERA that I know it's kind of surprising because we always hear how they oppress women, but
And the U.S. has opposed equal pay for equal work.
okay. Mm-hmm.
So for just a quick personal thing, as you kind of looked around when you said who's of the age to the Iranian hostage crisis, I at the time was a practicing Sikh, and I was living in Washington, D.C., so I was wearing a turban and I had a long beard, and people assumed that I was a Muslim. So anytime I would walk down the street and have people screaming, Ayatollah, we're going to cut your fucking heads off, so I really lived through the Iranian hostage crisis myself. A little personal story.
Oh yeah, there was vitriol.
And Sikhs, Sikhs it's an Indian religion. They're not Muslims, although a lot of similarities. So the one thing I wanted to bring up is the vote in the Senate about Yemen recently, where Bernie Sanders and a couple of the senators said we have to finally stop bombing. We have to stop bombing Yemen. And I would have wanted to. He was in Allentown, where I live, endorsing our local congressional candidate. I didn't have the chance. I wanted to stand up and say, why didn't you ask for the bombing to stop when Obama and Hillary were bombing Yemen? Why didn't you stand up then? And of course, the vote didn't win. But I still don't quite understand our motivation. You're saying, Ben, that it has nothing to do with Iran. Does our government understand that? Why are we doing it? I mean, it's such a small, tiny country. I know we want to stamp out Arab nationalism everywhere, but I don't quite get why. What is the motivation? And if it's not about Iran, that we're committing such a horrific war crime, I don't quite get the motivation. I need to know the motivation to be able to talk to other people.
It's a great question.
Isn't the population of Yemen greater than Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, although it's the poorest country in the Middle East. I addressed some of that. One quick correction. I I didn't say it has nothing to do with Iran. I said it's not an Iran-Saudi proxy war. It certainly has things to do with Iran. And in fact, I mentioned Iran supports the Houthis politically in terms of media support, and the Houthis are allied politically with Iran. They're allied with Lebanese Hezbollah. They're allied with the Syrian government. I simply pointed out that it's not an Iran-Saudi proxy war, as media outlets frequently stress. As for why the war is happening, a few different things. It's a great question. I mean, sorry I wasn't as clear when I was trying to spell that out. A few different things. So, of course, it's about having a suppliant regime in Yemen that will be allied with Israeli, Saudi, American, British, Emirati interests. I didn't point out, my mistake, that the Houthi slogan is in fact death to America, death to Israel. So clearly the U.S. is not going to, be content with a government, allied with Iran that is led by a political organization that chants death to America, death to Israel. But even more than that, Yemen is a very poor country, but it is also very strategically located. Specifically, the Mandab Strait in southwest Yemen, known as Bab al-Mandab. Every single day, 3 to 4 million barrels of oil travels through this strait. Estimates vary, but between 2/3, as many as 3/4 of trade ships go through this area. This is a strategically very important area, specifically for trade to Asia. And if you look at a lot of the fighting, I mentioned that the war has largely been a stalemate since the beginning of the war. Sarah pointed out that at the beginning, the Saudis and the Americans, which were backing them, claimed this would be a few weeks. It would be a very quick war. They would just mop up Ansar Allah, the Houthi movement, and force them back into Sada in the north. Of course, it's largely been a stalemate. They did force the Houthis out of elements of the parts of the south, Aden and other parts. But a lot of the fighting has been centered around Hodeidah, I mentioned, which is on the port. It's the major port city on the sea, on the southwest, which is a very important strategic trade area. And if you might have seen some media reports of alleged Houthi missile attacks, supposedly on a U.S. Navy ship, which was originally reported in a complete fiasco. The State Department claimed that Iran had attacked U.S. ships off of the coast of Yemen. First of all, the U.S. has no right under international law to have these ships off the coast of Yemen there. I mean, the U.S. is imposing a brutal naval blockade. But even beyond the illegality of the naval presence, it was totally false. It was not an Iranian attack. It was an alleged, maybe Houthi missile attack on a U.S. naval vessel off of the coast in the Mandab Strait. And even that might have been a false report based on a malfunctioning radar. So there's the important geopolitical, geostrategic location of Yemen. And then, of course, again, political alliances. If you just look at where Saudi Arabia is located, the Houthi movement, Ansar Allah, have waged attacks inside the southern area of Saudi Arabia. They've actually broached the border in the north. That's almost unprecedented in modern history. I mean, Saudi Arabia is an extremely fragile regime, of course, since the 1930s, when the current Saudi regime was solidified. And then especially since 1945, FDR, a good anecdote is, FDR spent his last Valentine's Day 1945, meeting with King Ibn Saud and forming a famous pact in which the U.S. pledged to provide security for the Saudi regime in return for oil. Exactly. There's a famous photo where his translator is sitting next to him. So the Houthis actually pose a political threat to the Saudi regime, which is, undergoing reforms now because it's so unstable. And the Americans and other, the patrons of Saudi Arabia recognize how unstable of a regime this is. King Salman is probably senile. In fact, there are rumors that as soon as the end of Ramadan, he might step down, he might abdicate for his son, who's effectively the ruler, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. MBS is being portrayed glowingly in all these corporate media outlets as a reformist, even as a revolutionary. Of course, he's actually arresting women's rights activists while claiming that he's going to let them drive. And to be a little fair, I mean, I don't say this that much, but the New York Times actually did a pretty good report recently on this group, the SCL Group, which is the parent company of Cambridge Analytica. And there's been some reporting on this finally after Russiagate is dying down, and we're looking at the actual infiltrators of the 2016 election. And of course, Cambridge Analytica was one of these companies that was profiting over electoral manipulation, manipulating people's opinions. And Cambridge Analytica's parent company, SCL Group, was paid by the Saudi regime to do detailed intelligence work of the Saudi population and find certain policies that the Saudi regime could implement to maintain its stability. So the Americans and British, which are the regimes that are really supporting Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis in this war, without American support, as even the New York Times editorial board acknowledged, Saudi Arabia could not wage this war. The Saudi military does not have much military experience. As Sarah mentioned, as I mentioned, the U.S. is providing Saudi Arabia with billions of dollars of weapons, advanced military technology, military intelligence. There are American and British military officials physically in the command room, the bombing command room for Saudi Arabia. This is inextricably a U.S.-British war, and it's about maintaining the stability of the Saudi regime, maintaining access to these critical trade routes, preventing a pro-Iranian, pro-Syrian, pro-Hezbollah government from emerging in the South based on political leaders that chant death to America and death to Israel. And also Mohammed bin Salman. This is supposed to be his pet project. Mohammed bin Salman, who was formerly the foreign minister before establishing dictatorial powers, purging his political rivals. It's so funny how any other purge in history, if it's a purge led by U.S. enemies, is portrayed as the most evil thing ever. But in fact, the political purge in Saudi Arabia was applauded. Mohammed bin Salman killed some of his cousins in mysterious helicopter accidents, all in the span of a few weeks. He imprisoned bin Talal and several others, Wahid bin Talal. And this was, Thomas Friedman basically praised this as the revolution going on in Saudi Arabia. And when he was foreign minister, Mohammed bin Salman made Yemen, the war in Yemen, it was supposed to be his pet project to show that he's a political leader who can lead his country and wage these important political conflicts to maintain the stability of his regime. So it's a multiplicity of factors, but those are the main ones.
Do these wars also go back to like the?
Sorry.
All right, go ahead.
You only got a couple minutes.
Yeah, sorry.
How do you read the Obama-Kerry agreement with Iran? Given the reversal by Trump, but what's behind? The Iranians had no nuclear weapons program. It was just a sole deal on the basis that they were going to get rid of nuclear. But I mean, there was no program. There was an outreach to Iran on the part of.
Yeah, I think there's a few things. Yeah, so first of all, right, our own U.S. intelligence agencies concluded they were not trying to develop
nuclear weaponry. By the way, they were continuing the nuclear energy program that the U.S. had helped the Shah begin, interestingly enough. And so it wasn't about that. I do think, there's a couple theories. I mean, certainly one was U.S. businesses were quite excited to be able to get into the Iranian market. I mean, as was pointed out by Sarah, Iran has 80 million people. It's the 17th largest country in the world. Capitalism's always looking for new markets, and Iran had been off, the menu for a long time, and IBM and other companies were very excited to be able to get back into Boeing, into that market. So I think that's a big part of it. Now, others have written, and I have my own, I wonder the same thing, and I actually talk about this in the book. Others have wondered whether, truthfully, the nuclear deal was a deal the U.S. made with the intention of breaking. That is to say, that, and there were some think tanks that had argued that we should do this, essentially agree with Iran to some sort of deal which in the end we'd accuse the Iranians of breaking, and then we would use it as a pretext for a military invasion. And there's some evidence that this was true, that Obama was starting to back off on the Iran deal before he left office, and of course Trump finished that process. So the question is, again, was the Ayatollah correct to begin with, that the U.S. never had an intention of going through with this deal? And frankly, when I was in Iran, there was a lot of bitterness about the fact that Iran had upheld its part of the deal, and the U.S., even under Obama, had never fulfilled its deal to lift all the sanctions, that it was still economically isolated. The Iranian people never got the benefit of the deal. when I was there, and I'm sure it's true today, you can't use a Western credit card in Iran. You can't use an ATM to get out money. I mean, it's almost impossible to travel there unless someone sponsors you to go there. It's a very isolated country. They had hoped that that would end with this deal, and it never did, and it certainly isn't going to now. So those are the two thoughts I have on that issue.
So it's serving kind of explanation, isn't it, from the Iranians' point of view? I mean, the Iranians have interests in the region. You know, they're not I mean, they may be the biggest manufacturer of condoms, or, you know, the statistics that Stan read, you know, but they just had some demonstrations, worker demonstrations. When you look at it from the point of view of the Iranian working class, they're not doing so good. Unemployment is, you know, up, and, you know, the Iranian bourgeoisie, they have some interests. You know, they're not just protecting the Houthis politically out of charitable, you know, reason. They're not, you know, operating in a region out of charitable interests. So those interests, from the Iranian point of view, are in the forefront.
Can I take the other?
30-second comment.
Yeah,
Of course,
that's a good question.
every country does want to expand its influence, of course. No one's denying that. That doesn't mean that Iran is taking over these countries, and that would be a ridiculous comparison. But quick point about the JCPOA. It's important to understand this is not just a U.S.-Iranian deal. This is a country of the this is a deal between the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus 1, which would be Germany. So it's China, Russia, the U.S., the U.K., France, and Germany. These are all of the countries that, and the European Union is a signatory on the JCPOA as well. So when Iran agreed to this deal, the point was to prevent the crippling American and European sanctions on the Iranian economy, which are preventing it from developing, which are contributing to things like high unemployment. The rest of the world, including all of the other signatories, are sticking to the deal. It's only the U.S. that is backing out of this multilateral agreement.
Just along to your question. I brought comparative religions to my university as professor in 1962, after having served 3 years as chief of crypto with the Army Security Agency. We were all against setting up the war in Vietnam, and critical even in those days of the CIA. My concern, of course, is the invention of radical Islam by the CIA